Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Panchali Moitra from SNDT Women's University, Mumbai, India. And I'll be presenting the findings of our study that's applying the health belief model to plan and implement a nutrition behavior change intervention in school children. The study was supported by a research fellowship grant offered by the government of Maharashtra, India. A school-based nutrition education intervention can offer convenient opportunities for providing meaningful health-promoting information. However, research shows that the gains in knowledge might not necessarily translate into behavioral changes unless learning strategies are carefully focused to facilitate adoption of desired behaviors. Behavior change remains an iterative, complex process that requires a thorough understanding of what is relevant, what is culturally acceptable, and what is age appropriate. Therefore, any successful behavior change intervention may not only entail an underlying behavior change theory to guide the strategies and content development, but should also include the strategies that address the resistance points and therefore promote desired practices. Among several health behavior theories, the health belief model is one of the most widely used conceptual framework to guide the development and design of behavior change interventions. The four constructs of the health belief model, that is the perceived susceptibility and severity and perceived benefits and barriers, posit that an individual is more likely to modify or engage in healthy behaviors when they perceive the benefit of taking preventive action greater than the perceived barriers. In India, there's been several nutrition education programs in both community and school settings. However, the previous literature shows that there is indeed a lacuna when it comes to the area of theory-based and behaviorally focused nutrition education interventions. Also, there is limited knowledge with regards to the attitudes and perceptions of key stakeholders, and there are no validated instruments that have been yet developed to measure these variables reliably. Under this context, we conducted this study to evaluate the effectiveness of a multi-component school-based nutrition behavior change intervention on knowledge, attitudes, and practices related to dietary habits in 10 to 12 years old children in Mumbai, India. The specific objectives were first to evaluate these perceptions and attitudes among the stakeholders, that's the children, parents, and teachers using focus group discussions. Second, to develop and validate a questionnaire that can reliably measure these indicators. Third, to design nutrition education modules based on the health belief model constructs targeted at both children and their parents. And finally, to assess the changes in knowledge, attitudes, and dietary habit-related practices in children who participated in this program as compared to those who did not. We conducted this study referred as the Healthy Eating and Activity Program for School Children, or in short, the HEAPS study, in three distinct stages. The first stage involved conducting focus group discussion. The second stage was when we developed and validated the KAP questionnaire. And finally, the pre and post-intervention assessments were done. The transcripts derived from the focus group discussions were reviewed, coded, and analyzed using the scissor and sort method, and the recurrent emergent themes were identified. For validation of the CAP instrument, we recruited 295 children from 2 private and 2 aided schools in Mumbai. Out of these children, 28 participated in the face validity exercise, 252 completed the questionnaire for testing validity and internal consistency measures, and a subsample took the retest to estimate the test-retest reliability. This is the summary of the steps involved. The details of the methodology can be seen at the reference provided here. To design the education aids, we developed a theoretical behavior change intervention model. This was followed by a thorough review of the science textbooks of grade 6 and 7 students, and then developing age-appropriate teaching aids and materials such as presentations, crossword puzzles, themed notice boards, activity books, videos, and several games and quizzes. These resources were reiterated through classroom teaching, competitions and awards, and role play skits. For parents, we developed several activities such as healthy plate models, posters, display corners, and recipe demonstrations were also conducted. To test the effectiveness of this model that was developed as a part of this study, we conducted a cluster randomized controlled trial. 2 aided schools and 2 private schools were randomly allocated to either an experimental or control group. The children in the experimental group received 12 weekly sessions of nutrition education and 3 sessions for their parents. This is the sampling protocol. In brief, the selection of the schools using a cluster randomization process ensured that there was a proportional representation from children belonging to different socioeconomic status. Statistical analysis were performed to determine the between group and within group changes from baseline to endline. The key findings of the focus group discussions revealed that there were 4 main themes. That's the knowledge, the perceived susceptibility and severity, and different environmental and individual factors. And the stage 2 results indicated a development of a valid and reliable instrument that comprised of 84 items. The details of these studies are provided in the references here. The results of the randomized controlled trial are provided in this section here. Of 498 children who completed the pre-post analysis, 292 were from experimental schools and 206 from the control schools. After 12 weeks of intervention, we observed significant improvement in mean knowledge, attitude, and dietary practice scores as compared to the control group. Also, we looked at the mean subscale scores of knowledge, attitude, and practice items, and significant improvements were seen not only in the knowledge items, but also in the attitudinal variables such as perceived severity, barriers, and self-efficacy of the children. Significant improvements were seen in their mean daily intakes of food items, such as their green leafy vegetable intake or chocolate and carbonated beverage consumption patterns. In conclusion, the study, though limited by a modest sample size, selection of participants in an urban setting, presented a proof of concept of the potential benefits of integrating nutrition education into an academic curriculum and the adoption of evidence-based BCC strategies, which entail critical thinking, several interactive activities, inclusion of parents as partners to improve not only the knowledge, but also a fostering of the positive attitudes and encouragement to adopt the healthy eating behaviors. We believe that this model that was created here as a part of the study and even tested and shown to be beneficial can serve as a guide for developing future school-based health promotion interventions. Thank you so much for your patient listening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Panchali. Maitra, this is very wonderful. I just want to encourage the audience to please continue putting the questions for her, and then we will address them after two more talks. Our next talk is by Sedenia Teodros, who's going to present a systematic review of social behavior change strategies in nutrition-sensitive agriculture interventions. So over to you, Sedenia.
Okay, great. Thank you everyone for attending. Like she said, my name is Sedenia and I'll be presenting on a systematic review of social behavior change techniques in nutrition-sensitive agriculture. This study was funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the principal investigator is Amy Webb-Gerard, who is an associate professor at Emory University. So to give you a little bit of a background of our study, agriculture projects with the explicit aim of improving household and individual diet quality, also known as nutrition-sensitive agriculture or NSA, address a major determinant of food intake because they provide access to nutritious foods. In low and middle income countries, agricultural strategies have been shown to improve women and children's diets. Research has also shown that social behavior change, or SBC, is an important component of nutrition-sensitive agriculture programs. However, there is some variation in how exactly nutrition SBC is integrated in agriculture projects, including what specific behavior change techniques, or BCTs, are used. So keeping this in mind, our study had 3 objectives. So the first is to generally describe how projects design and implement SBC components of their nutrition-sensitive agriculture programming. The second was to identify specific behavior change techniques, or BCTs, used in these projects. And then the third was to understand whether there are any associations between the BCTs and positive diet quality outcomes. So I'll give a brief overview of the methods. We searched various databases for published and gray literature using predetermined search terms. For our inclusion criteria, we were looking for articles that were published between the years of 2000 and 2021 on nutrition-sensitive agriculture projects that had specific nutrition-focused SBC activities. And when we say nutrition-focused, we're referring to activities that address consumption of nutritious foods. And then the third criteria was projects that were set in low and middle income countries based on World Bank classifications. Once we selected the final projects for inclusion, we abstracted relevant information into a structured abstraction tool. We then used a validated taxonomy to identify and code the specific behavior change techniques used in each project. And the creators of this taxonomy, Michi and colleagues, define BCTs as the active ingredient of a behavior change intervention. So they're the smallest replicable components of an intervention. So to give an example, there's a BCT called credible source, which would be coded if an intervention provided information about a behavior through an individual that the target population would view as trustworthy or reliable or credible, such as a health worker or a doctor. And there are 93 of these BCTs in the taxonomy. And then finally, we calculated effectiveness ratios for these BCTs to determine how many effective interventions they were used in. And I'll explain a little bit more about effectiveness ratios. To calculate effectiveness ratios, we first had to determine whether an intervention was effective or not. And interventions that had a significant positive impact on diet quality indicators, such as child diet diversity or women's diet diversity, et cetera, were determined to be effective. Effectiveness ratios for each BCT were then calculated as the number of times a BCT was used in effective interventions as a ratio of the total number of times that BCT was used in all interventions included in the assessment. This means that if a BCT was used in 10 interventions and 5 of them were found to be effective, the effectiveness ratio would be 5/10 or 0.5. So for our results, we had a total of 56 interventions that met our inclusion criteria. Most of the included interventions were located in sub-Saharan Africa or Asia or South Asia. And when we looked at some of the design characteristics of the interventions, we found that 31 had conducted some form of formative research, either primary, secondary, or both, to inform the design of their intervention. And then we also found that very few interventions mentioned basing their design and implementation or evaluation on any kind of behavioral theory. So you can see that 6 of them did that. And of those 6 interventions that did discuss using theory, the socio-ecological model for behavior change was the most commonly used one. And then when we looked at the SBC approaches that were used in these interventions, almost all of them included some level of interpersonal communication, so 52 of them, as you can see, with their target population. And then 44 of them, which is around 79%, used community-based approaches such as community outreach, mobilization, engagement, dialogue, etc. 46 out of the 56 interventions layered more than one approach to achieve change in behavior. And then we looked at the pathways that interventions took to get from agriculture to consumption of nutritious foods. And we found that almost all of them promoted at-home agricultural production for home consumption. And then around 60% of the interventions also aimed to increase agricultural production for income. And then the same percentage engaged women in agricultural activities. And then we're going to look specifically at the BCTs. This slide shows some frequently and less frequently used BCTs. It's not an exhaustive list, but it provides some examples of each BCT. And we found that interventions used an average of about 7 BCTs in their programming. The BCT called instructions on how to perform the behavior was the most frequently used one in all 56 interventions. Another common BCT was social support, which is often coded when participants received individual counseling, at-home advice, etc. BCTs such as behavioral practice, action planning, problem solving were less frequently used. And then finally, when we looked at the effectiveness ratios for these BCTs, we find that the BCT called behavioral practice had an effectiveness ratio of 1, indicating that all of the interventions that used this BCT had a significant positive impact on at least one indicator of interest. Other BCTs, such as instructions on how to perform the behavior or social support, had lower effectiveness ratios. So to conclude, although all nutrition-sensitive agriculture interventions are adhering to some best practices, for example, by layering multiple SPC approaches, few are using behavioral theory and intervention design, implementation, and evaluation. And then some BCTs with higher effectiveness ratios are less frequently used than those with lower effectiveness ratios. And there is a further need to investigate whether certain combinations of BCTs are associated with more effective interventions. And with that, I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sedania. That was wonderful. I hope everybody has a lot of questions. I certainly do. Thank you for presenting on that. Next, we have Dr. Gregory Cooper from University of Sheffield in UK, who's going to present on food environment domains in Hyderabad and India and Indonesia. And after this talk, we'll have about 10 minutes to chat and discuss these 3 presentations. Thank you. Over to you, Greg.
Okay, well, hello, everybody, and it's great to be a part of this session. Today, on behalf of my colleagues on the Action Against Stunting Hub, I'm really happy to share some insights from the survey pre-testing we've been doing in India and Indonesia of a new food environment experience survey we have been developing. So just to jump into the background, one slide overview. So the last 5 to 10 years, we've really had an increased understanding of how the environment around us shapes our food choices in terms of what we desire, what we acquire, and also what we end up ultimately consuming. But a lot of research has been focused on high-income countries and less on the more kind of dynamic and often informal food environments in low-income countries. And also less focus has been given to the more kind of healthy food environments, which are critical to delivering the nutrient-dense foods, which are part of the strategy of tackling health issues such as childhood stunting and wasting. And we have been developing a new food environment experience survey, which really aims to understand the perceptions of households and then more broadly the communities towards their food environment in terms of the availability, affordability, and accessibility of nutrient-dense foods. And ultimately, we hope that this information will help to inform interventions and policies which can help to start to bring down some of these barriers in such food environments and communities. And just to give you a very quick 1-slide overview of the food environment experience tool, essentially it is focused around 3 key modules. And the first is defining the activity space of the household, of where they go to acquire food for household consumption. That's purchases, that could be own production, it could be gifts, and so on. And then from those sources, we also then ask about the perceived availability, affordability, and how often the household actually got food from those sources. In turn, we then ask about the perceptions of these different food environment domains, the perceptions of the sources around these different domains. So, the availability of kind of safe and hygienic food in these sources, their perceptions towards physical safety and ease of access, and so on. And then lastly, we also ask the participants to then explicitly rank the different food environment domains in terms of importance, how important are these different domains in informing their decisions about where they go, and the dark green leafy vegetables, that's the food item we've been using so far to really develop and test this survey. So that's the kind of overview of the food environment experience tool, and this is still very much under development. And one of the main ways we've been developing this tool and validating this tool is through the use of cognitive testing or cognitive interviewing. This is part of a longer chain of kind of methods and techniques around developing this food environment tool. And cognitive testing essentially is a technique some of you will be familiar with, which is really about collecting information about the questions in our survey or questionnaire in this case. And really what we've been aiming to do over the last 9 months, both in India, in Hyderabad in Indonesia, and in Lombok, Hyderabad in India and Lombok in Indonesia, we've been using cognitive testing to understand the extent to which the participants interact and engage and understand the concepts and the constructs involved in the survey in terms of food availability, affordability, and so on. But also then evaluating the kind of the local translation, thinking about are certain terms or relatively colloquial language, are they more appropriate, and can we ultimately improve our survey to then make it more smooth when we're actually out piloting the survey and then eventually rolling the survey out into our around about 600 cohort households in both Indonesia and in India. And the way we've been doing this in the field, I'm just conscious of time, so I'll keep going here. The way we've been doing this is we've done 2 rounds of cognitive testing, whereby improvements are made to the food environment tool after the first round. And essentially the approach we've been taking is known as a probing approach, where we initially ask the survey respondent the survey question. For example, in the last 30 days, in the locations, places you've visited as part of your daily routine, how often the dark GLV is available. They then answer the question, and then we follow this up with a number of different probes to try to understand the extent to which the participant was able to engage with the recall period or with certain key terminology, or whether they've been able to match their answers to the answer options, the multiple choice questions and the Likert scales which we have provided as part of the tool. And please feel free to, I'm just conscious of time, so I'll keep going here onto the results, but any questions, feel free to stick them in the chat box. So on to some of the kind of the key headline takeaways. Something we found was the participants, both in India and Indonesia, initially struggled to kind of engage with the concept of affordability. And something we often found is they would often talk about price and cost, but they weren't able to then link that to the price that they are able to spend, or the capacity of them and the household budget to actually turn a price into something that is affordable. And this required changes in the language and the phrasing in our surveys to help communicate this. We also found that participants often confused like questions around food safety and convenience with questions of physical safety. This would be interesting that markets which are often close to the communities were often considered as safe, kind of these transitory spaces, rather than the actual markets themselves. We also found that participants kind of clumped together different food safety aspects, and they often talk about, the main thing they would consider when buying, say, spinach would be how fresh it would look. And there's an interesting question here around the extent to which we need to disaggregate different food safety issues, hygienic versus the presence of pests and so on, versus just using some of the terminology used in the local communities. And just very lastly, we also had questions on taboos and stigmas associated with the dark green leafy vegetables, and often the participants kind of looked at us with amusement, as this would be more relevant to something like animal source foods, chicken, eggs, and so on in our study locations. One of the key aims of this tool eventually will be to be adaptable to different food environments and food items. So I have about 45 seconds left, so I will just skip through here and say that we found that cognitive testing was really important, both to help make the tool more relevant culturally to the participants themselves, both through the language, but also the questions that we were asking. And although the survey got longer in terms of number of questions and the skip logic, we found that overall in the field, participants were able to interact better. And also we added photos and emojis and various different kind of multimedia to help communicate these concepts. Kind of just concluded there anyway, and I'm just conscious of time. So I will leave these up just for a couple of seconds and say thank you very much for listening. Really looking forward to the discussion. And yeah, over to you, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Sorry you have to be rushed, and it looks like you already have a couple of questions. We'll start with you, and then we can go backwards to other speakers as well. So we're going to take a pause here and discuss for 10 minutes. So please feel free to put your questions here. So our first question, it looks like that was answered, and it's for Greg. Wondering if you found distinctions between Hyderabad and Lombok when adapting the tool on food insecurity, food experience.
Yeah, that's a really great question. To be honest, most of the differences were found in the language because we had the local translation teams. So there were particular issues, say, around, let's say, food safety components, which translated better into Telugu than they did, say, Bahasa Indonesia. And then we had to have a number of discussions around to what extent do we make changes to the tool and to keep things as general as possible, but also then culturally as specific as possible there. So that took some time to kind of figure out, and a bit of back and forth between the different teams. Trying to very quickly think about any particular I think because we chose dark green leafy vegetables, it was relatively, there aren't the taboos associated with its growing or eating. I think, to be honest, in those senses, we did find significant differences. It was mainly around the language and the framing, and just trying to communicate those terms in the local languages. That's a really good question.
Yeah, no, this is great. I think we would be looking forward to to seeing the tool when it comes out, to see really assess the difference in the decisions you made to make it culturally relevant as well as generalizable. So there's another question for you. I noticed the photos of cognitive testings use different visual aids or visual aids in the tool, used in the tool and data collection. I think you mentioned emoji.
Yeah, so thank you, Zach. So really good question. So yes, we provided visual tools such as images of the about 18 different sources of where people could acquire, so purchase or grow dark green leafy vegetables. So we had those prepared, and various, actually say, emojis for Likert scales of how, or various, but say Likert scale emojis of how ashamed people felt around eating dark green leafy vegetables. So we took those along initially to the cognitive testing to help communicate some of the concepts. But then we found that they were super effective, and we then left them into the main tool, and then tested them again in the second round. So initially they weren't part of the food environment survey. They now are part of the food environment survey. It's just part of the process. Now, if we were to do somewhere else, we'd have to then find culturally appropriate photos again.
Sure. No, that's great. That's great to know. Thank you. We're gonna move on to our next. Tisadenia, someone had a question for you. You mentioned that the socio-ecological model is the most commonly used in agriculture nutrition interventions that base their programming on a specific model. Do you think it's appropriate, or are there other models that you would pitch?
Yeah, thank you for that important question. I think that based on the study that we did for this part of it, there's no specific theory that I would recommend for one thing or another. And I think also it really is dependent on what theory fits into what project, is dependent on the nature of the project. I will say though that determining best practices in social behavior change in agriculture projects is part of the work that our team is doing. And one of the core principles that we've determined is using theory in general is an important aspect of designing behavior change interventions, and using it at different levels, in terms of at the design level, at the implementation level, at the evaluation level. So I think that I would want to highlight the importance of using theory, but we didn't in this study try to identify which theory was more impactful, which one was more appropriate. And I think that it is very dependent on the design of your project. And I will also plug here that in the morning we did have a session on SBC best practices, and it should be posted on the ANH website talking about theory and other best practices in social behavior change.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. That's good to know about what models were or didn't work. I do have a couple of questions for you. There are a lot of complex RCTs or like complex programs that use multiple BCTs. How did you find, or did you guys weigh it, or did you try to attribute it? Like what was effective if you had multiple BCT employed that led to a different impact?
So that was my very last point. We haven't looked at combinations of BCTs, and how effective, or what difference they make in combination. It's a little bit more of a complex analysis than we've done so far, but I am planning to try and do that in the future. But right now we've just looked at the individual BCTs that were used in at least 4 interventions that qualified for the assessment.
Oh, that's good to know. Thank you. And then one last question that I had for you. Do you find if there are different BCTs employed in agriculture to nutrition interventions that engage men versus women, or both? Do you find any gender differences in the way BCTs are employed?
So we didn't look at BCTs by gender, but when we did look at the agriculture to nutrition pathways, we did see how many interventions engaged women in general, or had programming that focused on women's empowerment, women's increased decision-making for women. And I believe that number, like I said, was around 60% of the interventions. But specifically for BCTs, we didn't look at a gender aspect of it.
Okay. Thank you so much. That's fantastic. And then there's another follow-up for you. Why is it so important? From Anna Deaconu, who says, why is it so important to use theory? Can you give an example?
I may not be the most qualified person to answer this question. I think in general, it's important to use theory to frame your entire project design and implementation, so that it is focused, or you are using an evidence-based perspective to design. But again, I will refer you to the presentation that we had this morning, where my colleagues, especially a colleague from Save the Children, talked more broadly about using theory and in social behavior change programs.
We have another question for you. Can you speak more about studies that use socio-ecological model, that it would be useful for deciding what level to work on, but not the type of intervention should be used to address specific mechanism underlying health issue, like health belief model? Yeah, but can you speak more about how studies use socio-ecological model?
Yeah, I think in the studies that we looked at, they used it as like you said, as a way to decide what levels to target the intervention, not specifically to design what interventions to look at. And that is the extent of what we looked at. So did they use a theory, and how did they use it? And in this case, for socio-ecological model, they did use it to decide, okay, we're going to target multiple levels of influence, right? So the individual and the family and the outer setting as well. So unfortunately, like I said, we only had a few interventions that used theory. And so we weren't really able to compare how one works better or worse than another one.
Yeah, it's very, I often find people don't mention what theory they used underlying their theory of change or whatever it is, their interventions. And then, okay, so we have Dr. Panchali Moitra. I had a few questions for you. One, I would like to get clarification of what private versus aided school was. And then I noticed the results are fantastic from the RCTs, very promising. Carbonated soda intake, was that at 94%? Or that's insane.
No. First, private schools which are privately owned by the management, and obviously they cater to a high socioeconomic status. Okay. Now, government schools, some of them are owned by the government, some of them are provided some kind of subsidies in terms of the fee structure here. Those are called the aided schools. So in India, the municipal schools are the ones which are under the purview of government schools, where right from the teachers' salaries to everything from the infrastructure to the school fees are paid by the government. But the aided schools are usually run by a certain charitable trust or an NGO or any kind of private body, but they are supported by the government in terms of providing subsidies. But they usually cater to low socioeconomic status, and that's why we took up these two different category of schools and children from them to ensure representation across socioeconomic status. Carbonated beverages, yes, though we saw a higher consumption in the private school children as compared to the aided school children there, what you may have seen in the table is the percentage decline in the intake, and that is not in percentage, that's in milliliters. So what we did, we used a food frequency questionnaire, and then we employed some daily equivalent serving values, and did that we calculated, because when we did our psychometric testing, food frequency questionnaire came out to be easier for a 10-year-old to answer than a 24-hour diet recall. So therefore, we used food frequency questionnaire to find out the amount of consumption pattern, and therefore that's the way we looked at the change from baseline to endline.
Oh, that's fantastic, and it's great to know that from your psychometric evaluation as well. I think I have more questions. Maybe we'll ask at the end just to see where you're going to go next, like your next steps in terms of policy. But we'll keep that for the end, and then move on to our next set of speakers who are. Okay, so Dr. Eric Verger from CRAD is going to present on systematic scoping review of consumption of food away from home in low and middle income countries.
Thank you for the presentation. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eric Verger from IRD, the French National Research Institute for Sustainable Development. I would like to thank the scientific committee of ANH2022 to give us the opportunity to present our systematic scoping review of food consumption away from home in low and middle income countries. So, food consumed away from home conventionally refers to meals as well as snacks and beverages that are obtained, also not exclusively from a restaurant, cafeteria, food trucks, street outlets, or vending machines. Consumption away from home represents an increasing share of people's food consumption worldwide, also varying across countries and individuals. Previous systematic reviews have reported that overall consumption away from home had negative consequences. Indeed, 2 reviews reported that higher food consumption away from home was associated with a higher energy intake and poorer diet quality, and another review reported that higher food consumption away from home was positively associated with the risk of being overweight or obese. Yet, these reviews mainly focus on high-income countries, revealing the gap of knowledge and data in low and middle-income countries. And thus, the objective of the present systematic scoping review were to explore the recent literature documenting this phenomenon in apparently healthy population in low and middle-income countries, to summarize the evidence of the association between food consumed away from home and diet quality in the broad sense of diet quality, and to summarize the evidence of the association between food consumed away from home and nutritional status and health outcomes. To do so, we base our methodology on the PRISMA scoping review guidelines. So we developed a research strategy limited to peer review articles published in English from March 2011 until May 2021, and reference in Medline, Web of Science, and Scopus. We conducted a 2-stage screening process. First, titles and abstract were examined and irrelevant studies were excluded. And then full text were examined for eligibility against criteria I can explain later, leading to the inclusion of only 40 articles. And due to the wide heterogeneity in methods to measure food consumed away from home, but also the viability of the measure of diet quality, the measure of nutritional status and health outcomes, also the study design, and also the statistical models, we use a qualitative and descriptive approach to review the available evidence. In terms of results, so as you can see in the map, first we have to notice that the 40 studies only covered 12 countries. And we also have a huge imbalance in terms of geographical distribution of these articles, where we have an over-representation of 3 countries, so Brazil, China, and Malaysia, compared to the other countries. And in addition, we have to notice that in 5 out of 12 countries, in fact, the study were conducted not at the national level, but only at a local level. And when I mean local level, it was 1 or 2 cities only. Also, we found a large heterogeneity among the studies regarding the methods to measure food consumption away from home. First, it is important to note that less than 2/3 of the studies clearly mentioned food consumed away from home in their study objectives. Then, there were no consensus for the definition of food consumed away from home. The major definition we found was the place of consumption, so in a restaurant, in a park, or on the streets. Then we have few definitions being the place of preparation of the food consumed. It could be also the place of preparation and consumption, and sometimes the place of preparation and or consumptions. And another point is the period of time for which the behavior was measured was not consistent across study, and it greatly varied from 1 day to 3 months. And you can see that the most popular one was just last 24-hour recall or 1 week. And you can imagine it's very different in terms of measure. So please bear this methodological heterogeneity in mind for the upcoming result for diet quality and health outcomes. So we found that 22 studies assessed the daily energy contribution of food consumed away from home and or its association with a measure of diet quality. But the studies used data from 5 countries only, and half of them were conducted in Brazil. So we have a little bias in terms of representation here. 6 studies found that daily energy contribution of food consumed away from home varied from 9 to 35%. And of course, it depends on the population and country of studies. When I mean population, we have sometimes groups of children or young adults or older adults. So very various population here. And we found 20 studies that evaluated the association between a measure of diet quality. And when I say a measure of diet quality, it could be just nutrient intake, food intakes, or diet quality index, or dietary patterns. And so a measure of diet quality and food consumed away from home, and the majority of the study found an unfavorable association. So the higher the consumption of food away from home, the worse the diet quality. In terms of health outcomes, we found that 24 studies assessed the association with a measure of nutritional status and health outcomes. And here we only have 9 countries represented with slightly more than 1/3 of the study were from China. So again, a little bias in terms of representation. So the majority of the studies were focusing on nutritional status. So we had 19 studies focusing on nutritional status and food consumed away from home. And we have 9 that found an unfavorable association and 9 others that found a null association. The last one found a mixed association. It means that you had a null association for the risk of being overweight, but you have a positive association for the risk of being obese. And after we have the other health outcomes. So it's a very, let's say, fuzzy category because we had very different health outcomes. So if we try to briefly summarize them, there was 2 studies that found an unfavorable association with metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes in men, but not in women, so a mixed association. We had another one who found an unfavorable association with hyperuricemia in men, but not in women, and in middle-aged population, but not in youth and old age population, so another mixed result. One found a null association with elevated blood pressure, and we had one who found a null association with depression, while another one found an unfavorable association with depression and stress. So again, very non-convergent literature. Well, first, few study and not very convergent in terms of health outcomes. So the take-home messages for this presentation are as follows. So There is little information on food consumed away from home in low and middle income countries, with only 12 countries being represented. Yet we found that this phenomenon was quite common, whatever the country we were able to study. And we found that food consumed away from home seems to have unfavorable consequences on individuals' diet quality, nutritional status, and health in low and middle countries, like the high-income countries. So altogether, this highlights the need to develop harmonized surveillance system for monitoring food consumed away from home, including the development of a standardized definition. Thank you for your attention. I hope I was not too long.
Thank you, Eric. That was wonderful. And I think you already are starting to populate questions on your talk. And then we'll talk towards the end as well. Our next speaker is Dr. Limbakani Matumba from Malawi, and he's going to be presenting on knowledge, attitude, practices on food hygiene in rural Malawi. Over to you.
Right. As already introduced, I'm from Malawi. I work with Lilongwe University of Agriculture and Natural Resources, and the work being presented this afternoon was done in collaboration with GIZ Food and Nutrition Security Program. And the co-authors are presented there. As a matter of background, foodborne diseases are important cause of morbidity and mortality worldwide. Bacteria, viruses, protozoa, and more toxins are very important. And mothers are very critical in preparation of food. And we know the WHO 5 keys to safer food provide actionable guide to vet this risk. And again, good pre-harvest and post-harvest management is very critical in mod management. And with this background, we carried out a study to assess the knowledge, attitude, and practices, practice of rural Malawian mothers regarding their compliance of the WHO 5 keys to safer food, and also the good pre and post-harvest practices. So in our study, we went into 2 districts in Malawi, and we had about 522 participants. We asked the participants questions, and for knowledge, we had 3 levels. So true, don't know, or false, and same with attitude. And for practice, we had 5 levels, and where we had always, often, sometimes, occasionally, or never. And quickly, the results, we found that a significant proportion of our participants were unaware that hand washing without soap is efficient. And again, a significant proportion were unaware that baby feces may carry diseases even when the baby looks healthy. And regarding the agricultural practice, mothers were unaware that agronomic practices like late planting, weed infestation, pests, drought are promoters of mold infestation. They were not aware. And again, mothers were unaware of the consequences of the mold toxins that can depress immunity, that it can cause birth defects, that it can hinder growth, and that it can cause death if consumed in high amounts. And regarding attitude, our participants indicated that a good proportion of them that they found it unacceptable to demand water, running water, when water has been presented in a bowl, like a shared vessel. And they've also said they found it unacceptable to demand soap when they are at somebody's place. And again, good proportion also, they felt practices are generally unachievable for the resource constraints. So they also believed that it's unethical to throw away more the stuff when others are starving. So they would rather share with those who are starving. Regarding hand washing was mentioned in various aspects, but what we noted is that 90% did not use soap. So that's when they're coming from the toilet, when they've changed nappies. So they would wash their hands, but then in practice, 90% of the time they won't use soap. And again, we also discovered that they would use the same containers for food-related activities and non-food-related activities. And water sometimes would be left uncovered. And again, water would they would drink water, use the same cup to draw the water and drink as shown in the picture. Regarding practice, and only 6% constantly use soap to wash their containers, and 26% occasionally or regularly cooled porridge in their hands. So this is to cool the porridge before you feed the child. Again, we found that a good proportion, 57%, occasionally or always dried their produce on the bare ground, which we all know is the host, is the source of contamination. And only 2% claim to have always sorted their maize before using it. So they would all the mods will still be there. Right. Overall, trying now to compare the knowledge. When we assess the knowledge of the mother, they had slightly better knowledge of germs about the modes. But then, ironically, when it came to practice, seemingly they had better practices related to control of modes than control of germs, probably because the methods used to control the modes are this very same methods which are used to improve, perhaps not necessarily because of that. So in conclusion, there is lack of comprehensive knowledge about the bacteria, viruses, and protozoa, but also even the mold and more toxin. And this demands a comprehensive behavior change program if we are to really reverse this agri situation. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Lambakani. That was great. Next, we have Dr. Anna Dikanu, who's going to talk about complex behavioral motivation influencing farmers' adherence in Ecuador. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Hi, I'm Anna, and I'm here with you from Montreal in Canada. But today we're going to turn to the case of farmers in Ecuador. And as Ramya presented, we'll be talking about how complex behavioral motivators influence farmers' adherence to agriculture nutrition pathways. So this is a subject that came to us kind of from an existing debate between in the agriculture and nutrition community of practice about whether or not production diversity indeed promotes dietary diversity. So on one side of this debate is the rationale that this is a logically sensible expectation, given that if you produce a greater diversity of food, then you can also consume a greater diversity of food. And a number of studies, many studies have actually looked at exactly this association and have found significant p-values. But on the other side of the debate, there's the reason that, well, yes, there are significant p-values, but if you actually look at the effect sizes are rather small. And in many cases, it seems that increases to production diversity don't really create relevant increases in terms of nutritional health. And so here, these are just two reviews that discuss these debates, one from Dr. Jones and one from Drs. Sibatu and Kame. From our own research in Ecuador, we thought that we could kind of contribute a bit to this debate. Essentially, we had a research project in which we were looking at linkages between participating in agroecological farming and whether or not this could have positive impacts on the dietary health of farmers in resource-poor settings. And the main reason why we believe this can contribute to the debate is because agroecology, which is a sustainable farming practice, one of its central tenets is actually the increase of production diversity. So we thought that this could have an impact on dietary diversity and therefore people's ability to meet their nutrient needs. So to look at this, we had a mixed methods research design that started with a qualitative phase. We then moved on to a quantitative survey. And finally, we had an additional qualitative phase at the end. And this research, what it allowed us to do is to draw linkages between participation in agroecology on the left and some dietary indicators on the right. And we can focus in here specifically on the linkages between production diversity and two measures of dietary diversity. Now, just like in other studies, such as those presented in the reviews by Jones and Sibatsu and Kame, our effect sizes here, these numbers 0.19 and 0.28, are rather small, even though this is a significantly statistically significant effect here. So we had a couple of reasons to believe that why these effect sizes were so small that apply both to our study and likely to many others. One has to do with the compatibility of measures, because here in production diversity, we're looking at the number of distinct products produced. And here in food variety, we're looking at the number of distinct products consumed. So those are compatible. But dietary diversity, on the other hand, is composed of 10 different food groups, not distinct products. So of course, it makes sense that this number here is so small. Another issue is seasonality, because you might have a lot of diversity, but not all of your food that you grow is going to be available to be consumed every single day. And additionally, there may be diminishing returns from additional production diversity, in the sense that even if you grow 100 products on any given day, you're not going to eat 100 different food products. So to us, this made sense, and it was essentially enough from our external perspective. But when we turned back to our qualitative methods and saw what the research participants had to say, they offered us quite a bit more and stronger insights. First, they really insisted on the importance of production diversity to dietary diversity. To them, didn't matter how small the effect sizes would be, this was something that they perceived from their own reality, and they insisted on its importance. Additionally, they highlighted many other reasons beside dietary diversity that they would increase their production diversity. To look at that, we'll take an example of just one woman with whom I had a chance to spend about 2 weeks living with as part of an ethnographic process. Now, this woman here has a very high production diversity of 84 distinct products on a very small plot of land. But living with her and seeing her production, I saw that there were some pretty interesting things going on in this production diversity that would lend her such a high production diversity score. As just one example, I saw that she was growing a couple of papaya trees, but she lived in a very high altitude area where papaya trees will grow, but they will never actually bear fruit. So even though papaya is a vitamin A rich fruit, she's never actually going to translate that production diversity into dietary diversity. So I wanted to know why she grows papaya. Well, she said that she likes the trees, they make beautiful flowers, they attract birds, which she also likes, and because none of her neighbors have papaya trees, so she wanted to have them. So in these kinds of discussions with this woman and with many others, we saw that there are a number of reasons why farmers would grow production diversity, including aesthetics, a sense of experimentation and curiosity, allegiance to cultural identity, competition and pride, a sense of belonging to a social group, of course, the taste of different foods, and certainly many other reasons. And these are all what we call affective motivators, or motivators related to people's emotions, and these are guiding a lot of their behaviors. So if we turn to this very simplistic diagram of the pathway between production diversity and dietary diversity, which we often see in the agriculture and nutrition literature, what we can see is that these affective motivators act on production diversity and probably in a lot of other places along this pathway. And essentially what they do is they make it be that not all increases in production diversity result in increases in dietary diversity. And what this will do is that it reduces those statistical effect sizes that we saw, but it does not negate the importance of production diversity to dietary diversity. So to conclude, what we see here is that in these pathways, the agriculture and nutrition pathways, these are a set of instrumental, linear, and chain-link linkages that define the way that we as researchers are looking at the linkages between production diversity and dietary diversity. But if we look at farmers' actual human behavior, well, we see that that's not the way people think and act. Human behavior is complex, relational, and nonlinear. So as a result of that, when we are looking at these numbers of our effect sizes, we shouldn't be too discouraged by small effect sizes, because we have to remember that these effect sizes are capturing these instrumental, linear, and chain-like linkages, but these are not capturing the entirety of the complexity of human behavior. And there are many other factors that contribute to people's decisions around food, some of which will make us have those small effect sizes, even though production diversity is recognized as very important to people's dietary diversity from their own perspectives. So that is all, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna. That was a very wonderful presentation. Oh, it looks like you have a question. So we'll start with you, and then we can go to Limakani and others. So if this is a question from Eric. How did you deal with temporal mismatch that can exist between production diversity and dietary diversity? That was also my question, just looking at measurement or error around that. Go ahead.
Yeah, so we actually didn't look at that temporal mismatch. I mean, in the sense that we recognized that this was a limitation of our method, and we thought that in the future, what we should be doing is asking about the production diversity that is available on the day of the 24-hour recall, in the sense, what from your production can you actually consume on that day? But what we did do is we also looked at a different part of the study. We looked at everything in people's 24-hour recalls, where their food came from. So we could see if it came from their own production, from purchases in conventional markets, or through social economy, such as barter. And that gave us a stronger idea of the importance of people's own production to their consumption, because the people who had greater overall diversity across the year, they also had a stronger direct linkage between the foods that they obtained from their own production and what they consumed.
Yeah, I think that's a great question and an answer too, because I do think there's a lot of measurement error around that, or just measurement challenges around that. And a lot of the studies that have previously looked, even the reviews that you cited, have a lot of measurement. I'm kind of curious. One of the thing is that people don't take plot size into account. For example, you mentioned there was 84, and then there's like two papaya trees, they might produce, every other week. That's you might still have something that maybe you consume once every 2 weeks, right? So that's also kind of problematic. I'm kind of curious, Anna, just from your 2-week ethnography, what other factors did you think was good to measure for future studies?
Yeah, well, a lot. It's a very good question. And right, so this we did ethnography for quite a bit longer, and with this particular woman, it was 2 weeks. And through these qualitative methods, we saw that we really found it important to hone in on exactly what about production diversity you need to know, because from an agroecological perspective, the diversity across the year is important, even of foods like, let's say, papaya in a region that will never bear fruit. From an ecological perspective, well, it can give homes to birds, and birds are also pollinators, so they're important for the ecosystem, and so indirectly they can contribute to your food security or your food availability, even if there isn't sort of that direct connection in that sense. But what we found, because of the importance of people's social and cultural aspects and their behavioral aspects in general to their decisions around food, what we essentially concluded is that these are things that are very difficult to assess quantitatively in a survey, as much as we would like to. So we just concluded that it's very, very important to have a mixed methods approach where you are integrating sufficient qualitative evaluation in order to get at the heart of these questions.
That's great. That's great. Thank you so much for that input. Next, we will go on to, we have a few questions for Limbakani. First is from Jeffrey Asulu, who's asked, for the CAT study, can you give us further insights about the two different districts? And then he also asks about, do you think a repeated cross-sectional study will give the same results?
Right. Okay. Thank you so much for your question. I really rushed over because I wouldn't fit everything in the eight minutes. But yes, we calculated and we random. The sampling was random. In the going to your second question, for sure, yes. If you were to repeat the study, you'd get more or less the same results.
Any other questions for Dr. Limbakani, or should we move on to Eric? Eric, I believe you had a couple questions, and you might have, apologies if you already answered. I'm not able to keep track on the chat. One question was from Zach, who asks, of those included studies, do you have a sense of how many possibly one-off primary data collection versus secondary data? Maybe it was part of a national monitoring. He's interested because he's analyzing LSMS data collected from Ghana, which includes expenditures on popular mixed dishes prepared at restaurants and canteens.
Yeah, thanks for this nice question, Zachary. First, I forget to mention that, in fact, we study only individual level surveys. So we did not take into account household surveys. And because the household surveys most of the time do not assess food consumed away from home, they're just focusing on what's inside the household. And so in some countries, when you realize that 40% of energy intake could come from outside the household, it's a big issue. So in our review, most of the surveys were primary analysis. So they were collecting the data for this particular purpose, except for Brazil, where they have a national survey. They used a lot for different type of analysis.
The next set of questions were actually from me. I'm wondering if you could comment on the shorter recall period and then like the health and nutrition outcomes there on different scales, and also food away from home. There's also healthier options that might confound the relationship as well. So could you comment on that?
Yeah. On the first point, in fact, it's a typical question we have in nutritional epidemiology. Are we able to assess the usual intake or not? So when we have only 24-hour recalls, it's very too short to say even anything about diet quality. And so, yeah, I agree. It's a huge limitation of the different surveys we assessed, because most of the time they did not assess a proper usual intake of the food consumed away from home. Plus, most of the surveys we had were only cross-sectional, not longitudinal. So talking about the link for health outcome is very, very tricky. So again, it's just highlighting the lack of data we have. And your question, it's also, I think, kind of linked with a question of Mulia about this diet quality we have with this food consumed away from home. Most of the time, the problem is they consider food consumed away from home as a whole. But no, it's not a whole. It's very diverse according to different people. And it was mostly in Brazil where they had the opportunity to be very precise, because they have these very nice national surveys where they be able to go deeper in the different patterns. And in fact, they realize that you can have healthy and less healthy foods in food consumed away from home. So it really depends. And so I think the next level in terms of research will be able to do different patterns of food consumed away from home to understand how it can contribute or not to a healthy diet. Because in some contexts, you say, okay, you will have access to more to fatter and more sugary products, but maybe in other context is just having an additional or just having access to some animal products that can increase your dietary diversity or your intakes of zinc and iron. So it really depends on the context, and the main issue so far is the lack of data we have. So
yeah, I'm sure
that's why it's difficult to say at the end of the day if it's really an LC or non-LC.
Yeah, it's and also I'm sure urban rural differences also exist probably, and it's hard to see when most of your studies come from Brazil. I think you also had some follow-up questions from Mbazia Dixon. I'm sorry, I'm probably messing up your name. Did you look at socioeconomic classes of those who are eating outside the home, and did you subsample 20% to be able to do usual intake? I think this is a review, not the actual study, but go ahead.
Yeah. We just perform a review, so we try to see if these studies try to look at socioeconomic classes or also, and most of the time they were not really looking at these determinants. And so, yeah, we didn't do any analysis. We were performing just a review. But I agree, it would be nice to, if you have just 24-hour recalls or repeated 24-hour recalls in your own study, it would be nice to try to perform usual intakes. But again, we are just a review.
Okay, and then we have one more question for Limbakani, who says, from Jessica, who says, did you study capture information from literacy or education level of women, and what was the correlation? Was there any correlation made there?
Right. Yeah, we also tried to capture that, but then when we did the analysis, we didn't really see a lot of like significant correlation between attainment in education and the behavior. And this was not surprising to us because all these were Ludo women. The subject of more toxin is not even for Leonard very well known.
Thank you, Mbakani. That was great. That ends our session. I hope it was a very exciting discussion, and please feel free to reach out to the authors if there are any pending questions and comments. And thank you.